Ruben is Senior Expert and Director of Reparative Justice, of the Reparative Justice Program at the International Center for Transitional Justice, where he works with victims communities and reparations policymakers in Nepal, Timor-Leste, Indonesia, the Philippines, Iraq, Palestine, Liberia, Ghana, South Africa, and Kenya. He also provides advice on issues involving reparations and war crimes tribunals in extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia and the International Criminal Court. Before taking his current position at ICTJ in New York, his career in the Philippines was quite distinguished, and it included serving.
Which you need not go through, David.
Well, I'll just go through quickly that you were the commissioner in charge of litigation and investigation of pursuing the ill-gotten assets of the Ferdinand Marcos family, and concurrently served on the UN ad hoc committee that drafted the 2003 UN Convention against Corruption, along with other work. So thank you for joining us today, Ruben.
Right. I don't know if I can share a couple of slides, David, because that will probably help.
I will note that.
Sure. Let me begin by thanking you and the organizations involved for this side event. ICTJ itself is involved in a couple of side events involving the different country programs we have. And so one of the country programs that we actually have is Colombia. And as some of you probably already know, Colombia has its own drug war, which is different from the Philippine drug war. But let me go through a couple of things. I thought I would focus on accountability for drug war human rights violations, which includes accountability for the drug war in the Philippines, but a little bit more than that. So right now we know what's going on in the United States, protests against racial injustice, protests in Europe as well against colonial injustice even. And some of those protests have included bringing down statues of Confederate generals or even the King of Belgium. So this is a statue in New York of Lin Tzu, and it actually just has one inscription. It just says drug war pioneer. He apparently opposed the British importation of opium into China, fought the British because of that, and was revered by the Chinese for that reason. So in a way, it's important for us to think of the longer, much longer historical context of drug wars and who's responsible for, in a way, introducing drugs to certain societies and which drug war we might be thinking about when we talk about drug wars. On the other hand, it's also important to look at accountability from a broader perspective, and that's how transitional justice comes in. It's a set of judicial and non-judicial tools for justice and accountability. Most of our work has been in post-conflict and post-authoritarian countries, and some of our work has involved addressing unresolved historical injustices, including, for instance, comfort women issues involving Japan in World War II, or even British colonialism in Kenya. So because it's both judicial and non-judicial, it's important to remember that our work and transitional justice isn't focused only on going to court. Some of the tools we use include truth commissions, and some of you are familiar with South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but it's not even the only truth commission, nor the first one ever established. There have been dozens of truth commissions across the world, and some of them have, in fact, addressed some of the racial, equality, and even drug-specific issues in certain countries. We also work on prosecutions of individuals and civil litigation, most of them involving reparations. I direct the reparations work in ICTJ, and so reparations isn't just about payment of money. It can include symbolic forms of reparations. It can include material forms of reparations that aren't necessarily about paying money. Some examples of symbolic forms would be apology or even memorialization, which is separate in many cases because it involves a larger set of issues around remembering. Our work also includes the vetting of abusive officials, and we are involved, for instance, in police vetting in Kenya or the vetting of judges in Armenia. And then there's reconciliation, which I put in quotes because it's always tricky to talk about reconciliation. We've recently seen slogans where, no peace without justice, and no justice without no reconciliation without justice. And so I leave it as a word in quotation marks. In terms of domestic accountability, whether it's for drug wars or for abuses in general, these are some of the steps that can be taken. I won't go into each of them, but they include civil society-led truth-seeking processes. And in the Philippines, as an example, I've worked with religious leaders to examine the possibility of neighborhood truth-seeking, neighborhoods affected by the drug war, and whether there's a possibility to undertake that. That's been overtaken by the pandemic, but even before the pandemic, one problem of whether it's truth-seeking or even prosecution is always the problem of safety and the problem of fear. When a drug war is still going on, it's very, very difficult to expect the families who have been targeted by the drug war, mostly poor, which is why I used that first slide. And it's impossible to expect them to simply come forward and seek justice in the open. There's a risk to their life, and even for human rights advocates, many of them can often be co-opted and tainted. One of the prominent so-called human rights lawyers in the Philippines, for example, is now the spokesperson of Rodrigo Duterte, and he was my classmate in law school in the Philippines. You have a corrupt prosecution and court system. And the last point I think is important in relation to the drug war. There's often this unnecessary but still persistent need of finding innocent victims, that we need to look for persons who are not drug dealers, who have not been taking drugs. And that is both a dilemma and an unnecessary dilemma, because there will never be a perfect victim. You can have children, of course, and many of them in the hundreds now, or at least over 100 now, have been killed in Duterte's drug war. But in terms of persons who testify in truth commissions or in court, it will be very difficult and also counterproductive to look for innocent victims. Some of the things that are indispensable, whether we are looking for domestic accountability or international accountability, would be documentation. And in the Philippines, that has been significantly done by the Commission on Human Rights as well as non-government organizations, which is precisely why information or complaints were brought to the ICC based on documentation. It's also important to preserve evidence, including forensic evidence. And this is a problem even with documentation, because some of the autopsy reports, some of the spot reports involving drug war killings are either inaccessible to civil society groups or even to family members of those who are killed. There's witness protection, and in the Philippines, as in many other countries where you have extrajudicial killing, witness protection is often offered by the same state that carries out the killing. So it's a dilemma, and therefore privately run witness protection programs might also be necessary. So what can foreign states do to pursue accountability? Well, that's been happening at the Human Rights Council, and as some of you may have seen recently, there have been calls at the Human Rights Council to create a commission of inquiry to investigate extrajudicial killings in the Philippines drug war. There can also be pressure through trade and diplomatic means. A good example is when Sri Lanka refused to investigate war crimes at the tail end of its conflict with Tamil rebels. Many European countries actually took away preferential tariffs for Sri Lanka in order to pressure the government into agreeing to a commission of inquiry, which they agreed to and then later took back. Can foreign states ask the UN Security Council to refer a case to the ICC prosecutor? That's what happened in Libya. That's not probably going to happen in the Philippines at this point, because you have two countries that might veto any referral by the UN Security Council. You have China and potentially even the United States. But there are also countries that can directly refer the Philippine situation to the ICC prosecutor. It's possible, for instance, that at some point Iceland might want to do that. But because there is already a preliminary examination at the ICC, it's possible that the ICC will move forward with this investigation of a crime against humanity of murder. I won't go into this, but I will quickly run through some examples of transitional justice mechanisms, some of which ICTJ has been involved in, that relate to both drug wars and more broadly the right to health, which some of you have been discussing. In Mexico, there is a proposed truth commission, which up to now has not been created, but it was meant, and it is meant to examine the impact of the drug war in Mexico, including thousands of enforced disappearances. There is an accompanying proposal to offer amnesties to those who have committed crimes and human rights violations in Mexico's drug war, both on the government side and even on the side of drug cartels. In Colombia, there is a peace agreement already being enforced, and it includes provisions on the use of land that's been cultivated for drug purposes, as well as innovative penalties for the FARC, the rebel group, and some of the other armed actors that are linked to trafficking in Colombia's larger conflict. In the United States, Chicago has a reparations program and various transitional justice measures specifically addressed at police abuse, but including police abuse related to the US drug war. ICTJ has been working with the Drug Policy Alliance over the last 3 years. We started with the New York chapter of the Drug Policy Alliance, and one of the discussions involved collective reparations for neighborhoods, mostly Black neighborhoods, brown neighborhoods in New York that were targeted in the long running, in the decades of drug enforcement, and what forms of reparations are possible for them. One idea that was also discussed was the possibility of a mobile museum that would travel across New York, showcasing the impact of the drug war on Black and brown communities. And a point about the right to health and the pandemic, because I think this is something that might be helpful. In 1918, right after New Zealand, right after the flu pandemic spread to New Zealand and killed, I think, hundreds or probably even thousands of persons, New Zealand created a pandemic commission to examine the reasons why it spread there, how many deaths happened, and ways to prevent massive deaths in the future. I'm not saying that this truth-seeking measure is the reason why New Zealand in 2020, 100 years later, has been able to effectively control the spread of the pandemic. But you have some kind of anecdotal evidence that a serious truth-seeking process involving the right to health is possible and can have consequential impacts on the way we deal with health issues, whether it's drug-related or the pandemic. So let me stop there. And perhaps there are questions around the Philippines or questions around transitional justice mechanisms involving drug wars that you want to ask, and I can answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruben. I have a pair of questions, though they're sort of theoretical. But first, let me say, anyone who would like to ask a question, make a comment. In the participants section, there's a raise hand function, and if you use that, I will call on you. Gang, I see your hand. And we have one other person in queue from before, and I think probably a question for you, Gang. But my quick questions for Ruben. The ICC, as you referred to, has a preliminary examination underway on on the Philippines. And I attended the Assembly of States Parties to the Rome Treaty last December in The Hague. That's the treaty body that oversees the ICC. And the prosecutor Bensouda said that all phases of the preliminary examination into the Philippines are in the very late stages, and there will be a decision on whether to seek authorization to do an investigation during 2020. Now the words of very late stages to the layperson might seem, well, it probably won't take all of 2020. On the other hand, the ICC functions on long timescales. Was wondering if you've heard anything generally, if not specific to the Philippines, on how what unfolded with the pandemic may have affected their timetable. Also, on subject of reparations, and we emailed about this, there's a bureau of the ICC called the Trust Fund for Victims, and provides support to victims. I believe this would be following, probably would be following convictions in the court. And what might victims of Duterte's drug war or other victims whose cases come up as part of a so far still hypothetical case, what kind of support might go to people in the Philippines following, if there is a prosecution and convictions in a Philippines related case?
Well, I'll give you simplistic answers, David, to compress the time. On reparations, there is in fact a reparations law in the Philippines, and I even helped author that 15 years ago. But it's meant for victims of the Marcos dictatorship. And because you mentioned that I was involved in the recovery of assets of the Marcos family, part of those assets is what funds the reparations program for Marcos dictatorship victims. And that's important because reparations will require funding, whether it's symbolic or material. At the ICC, you're correct that the trust fund administers reparations for victims, and that reparations formally can only happen when there's a conviction. The trust fund, though, has an assistance mandate that can already be triggered when a case begins to trial, which is not where the Philippines case is right now. It's preliminary examination, as you correctly pointed out. And when the prosecutor says that they're in the last stages of that examination, you can see how complex this process is, because the stage of preliminary examination still requires a confirmation at the end of that by a chamber of the ICC saying these charges can be validly filed. And in that confirmation of charges stage, that's where the Philippines can in fact send a lawyer, and that lawyer can say, no, we're investigating on our own in the Philippines. We're trying to do our best to find accountability at the domestic level, and whether that's being done in good faith or not, that can delay any ICC trial. So we're really looking at years before an ICC trial can go forward in a expeditious way. And it's important to remember that, because in December this year, there will be a new ICC prosecutor. This new ICC prosecutor will serve for 9 years. And in relation to potential respondents in the Philippines case, you can only go to trial against people who are still alive by the time trial begins. So let's factor that in. And only a handful of people will normally be tried, not all of those policemen, for instance, who have been involved in extrajudicial killings will be sent to the ICC. So it will still be very important to have other accountability mechanisms in place, whether it's a UN Commission of Inquiry that then leads to prosecutions in the Philippines in the future, or even truth-seeking in the Philippines that can begin now, but perhaps not be carried out until Duterte is out of power. Which brings us back to the ICC itself. The ICC was asked to investigate Mexico's drug war under the former prosecutor Luis Moreno Ocampo, who rejected it, who said, no, it's a Mexican decision to proceed with that. So you have had opportunities for the ICC to exercise its powers over drug wars, over violence that comes with, the excuse of suppressing drugs and dealing with trafficking, but it hasn't. So this opportunity is important because I think the ICC has to be able to show that it's not simply a court that deals with armed conflict, that it's not simply a court that deals with countries that are parties to the ICC, and China, the United States, India. These are countries that are not parties to the ICC, so they won't necessarily be brought to that court. So it's important for the ICC to consider the Duterte Philippines case as an example of broadening its mandate, of making itself relevant. So let me stop there.
I'll say one hopeful comment that Prosecutor Bensouda made was that her view is from any examination which from which the information says that statute says there should be an investigation. Her view is they should open an investigation. That's not answer the question of resources and prioritization, and the court is not that large an entity.